The night held its breath. Cold air settled over a forgotten stretch of track somewhere in occupied Poland, the kind of place where even the wind moved quietly. A thin moon hung low, barely bright enough to show the men crouched near the rails. Their coats were worn, their boots muddy, their faces marked by too many sleepless nights. At the center of them stood the one they trusted most. He wasn't taller than the rest, nor louder, nor dressed any differently. What set him apart was the steadiness in his movements, the way his hands worked without trembling as he checked the wires one last time. In the dim light, his eyes carried a calm that didn't match the danger around them. A freight train was expected before dawn. Everyone knew it carried supplies meant for the German units pushing east. Everyone also knew the price of interfering with those supplies. The Germans punished sabotage with brutality, and the men here had seen enough villages burned to understand the risk. But still, they stayed, kneeling in the frost, breathing in shallow, careful pulls, listening for distant metal groans that might signal the train's approach. The leader pressed his palm to the cold rail, feeling for the faintest vibration. Nothing yet, just silence and the slow beat of his own pulse. He glanced at his men, only a handful, barely armed, barely fed, and gave a small nod. No speech, no flourish, just a quiet confirmation that they were committed. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called out, sharp and lonely. One of the younger fighters shifted nervously. The leader touched his shoulder, steadying him without a word. Far down the line, something stirred, a faint tremor in the steel, the first sign of the train they had come to stop. The men leaned in, every sense sharpening, waiting for what the night would bring. It began with the sound of engines in the early hours of the merged September 1939. People in towns near the western border woke to a sky streaked with smoke trails and the heavy thud of bombs. Some thought it was an accident. Others stepped outside and understood immediately. Germany had come. By noon that day, roads were filled with families carrying whatever they could hold, horses pulling wagons alongside cars that coughed and sputtered from overuse. Churches rang their bells, not for prayer, but for warning. Radios crackled with broken reports of the Polish defenses trying to hold the line near Wielun and the corridors leading toward Warsaw. Every hour brought news that felt worse than the one before. Then, just 16 days later, on 17th of September, another blow came from the east. The Soviet Union crossed the border, and whatever hope remained inside Poland seemed to collapse in a single morning. Two armies pressing in from opposite sides left people stunned, unsure where safety could even exist. What followed wasn't chaos in the wild, frantic sense. It was a slower, heavier kind, the kind that settles into the bones of a nation. Government offices emptied. Soldiers who had fought bravely were ordered to withdraw or break into smaller groups. Civilians stood in lines for bread, staring at posters written in German or Russian, reminders that their country had been carved apart without mercy. Something quiet began to move. In Warsaw, Krakow, Lwów, and in small villages with muddy roads and wooden fences, men and women started meeting in basements and back rooms. They spoke in low voices, careful not to let the wrong ears hear. They shared updates, passed on the names of trusted people, and tried to piece together some form of resistance. No one planned to become a fighter, not at first. Most just wanted a way to keep Poland alive in some hidden corner, waiting for the day it could stand again. Yet as the occupation tightened and fear grew, those small whispers became the earliest spark of the underground that would one day be known as the Home Army. And in that spark, men like the quiet leader by the rails first found their purpose, long before they ever touched a charge or studied a stretch of track in the dark. In basements and hidden rooms across a broken Poland, small groups huddled together, sometimes 2 or 3 people, sometimes a half dozen, quietly exchanging whispers. It was early winter, roads clogged with refugees, towns empty of hope, yet these clusters began to form the skeleton of something bigger. In the days after the occupation, the first resistance effort emerged under the name Service for Poland's Victory, SDP. That was in late September 1939, when a few officers and patriots decided if Poland had fallen, at least its spirit must remain. But as months went by, it became clear what was needed was more than whispers. On 13th November 1939, SZP gave way to Union of Armed Struggle, ZWZ, a clandestine armed resistance trying to gather the scattered fragments of defiance. Still, the name was not enough. The war dragged on. Danger climbed. People died. By February 14, 1942, the movement was reborn under a new name, the Home Army. The change marked more than a label. It was a statement. It meant the fight was official, organized, and determined. Under the banner of the Home Army, thousands volunteered. Farmers from remote villages, students from ruined cities, railway workers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, men and women who had lost homes, seen loved ones taken, yet signed up, quietly, without ceremony, at the risk of arrest or worse. They did more than hide. Some became couriers, carrying messages between cells. Others worked forging false papers. Many gathered scraps of weapons. A few learned sabotage. In places where German convoys rolled through empty fields or dark forests, they watched tracks, memorized timetables, studied guards. Because the Home Army was not just a fighting force, it was part of a hidden state, a secret version of Poland's institutions. It had its own underground administration, clandestine courts, covert education, and networks to keep hope alive even as cities burned. In that darkness, ordinary people became something else, volunteers, partisans, caretakers of a dream of a free Poland. So by the time our guerrilla leader stood beside the tracks in that cold, moonlit night, he wasn't alone. He carried with him the weight of a nation's silent vow, because what began as scraps of resistance had grown, quietly, steadily, into a nation in arms. Planted, the men of the underground learned to read the tracks the way others read a map. Every line, every siding, every wooden sleeper carried meaning. Under German occupation, the railways became the lifeline that fed the war in the east. Trains rolling day and night toward the front, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and troops who never stopped coming. In towns along the routes, people grew used to the distant rumble of locomotives. Some could tell, just by the sound, whether a train was heavy with cargo or packed with soldiers. Others learned the rhythm of the guards' patrols, the hours when the tracks fell quiet, the stretch of rail where the forest pressed close enough to hide a man crouched in the brush. For the Home Army, the rails were both a chance and a warning. A chance because breaking them, even for a few hours, forced the occupiers to scramble. A warning because the punishment for attempting it was swift and merciless. Villages near acts of sabotage risked collective reprisals. People knew this. The fighters knew it too. Every time they placed a charge, they carried that knowledge like a weight on their shoulders. Still, they watched the trains move eastward in steady lines. They saw German forces rely on timetables that rarely slipped. They knew how much damage even a single derailment could cause. A stalled line meant repairs, manpower, diverted resources, and delays that could echo far from the small Polish towns where the tracks cut through farmland and pine. Railway workers often passed quiet signals to the underground, a note pushed across a table, a muttered warning about a new schedule, a quick gesture showing where a guard now stood. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was survival turning itself into resistance. To the occupiers, the railways were machinery. To the Poles living beside them, they were something else entirely, a reminder that the war was always near, always feeding itself, always hungry. And to men like the leader waiting in the dark, the rails became a battleground without banners, just steel, silence, and the knowledge that one well-timed act could shake an empire, if only for a night. In the first years of occupation, the earliest sabotage attempts did not look anything like the later coordinated strikes that shook entire rail lines. They were clumsy at times, rushed at others, carried out by men who had almost no explosives, no proper tools, and no certainty that they would live through the night. Many attempts came from small groups acting on brief instructions passed through the Union of Armed Struggle, ZWZ, which formed the groundwork of the Home Army. By late 1941 and into 1942, rail sabotage slowly shifted from scattered acts to something closer to a pattern. What mattered most was timing. A few minutes too early or too late could mean the charge failed, or worse, expose the fighters to German patrols. Even so, damage began to add up. Tracks loosened, telegraph lines cut. A wagon here, a locomotive there. Small setbacks, but sharp enough to irritate the occupiers. German reports from the period often complained about unknown perpetrators damaging rail infrastructure in the general government, a sign that the underground was finding its rhythm. The Home Army's early explosives were often improvised, fertilizer mixed with fuel, old military stocks dug up from hidden caches. Sometimes the fighters relied on nothing more than crowbars and sweat, prying apart rails under the cover of darkness. A full derailment was rare in those first months, but even slowing a train by forcing repairs meant something. Materials delayed, soldiers rerouted, command growing uneasy. Each act carried a shadow. The Germans answered sabotage with public warnings, arrests, and at times executions meant to scare entire communities into silence. Posters appeared on walls listing the names of people shot in retaliation. Everyone saw them. Everyone felt the warning. And yet that fear did not smother the resistance. If anything, it sharpened it. By mid-1942, the Home Army's efforts became more coordinated. Intelligence units mapped rail lines with care. Couriers memorized train schedules, watching for the heavy transports bound for the Eastern Front. And sabotage groups refined their methods, turning scattered attempts into deliberate blows. Only a single charge. The men would crouch between the sleepers, fastening the device with shaking fingers, listening for the rumble that could arrive sooner than expected. Then they would slip back into the trees, hearts pounding, waiting for a sound that would tell them whether the risk had been worth it. These early blasts were imperfect, improvised, far from the large-scale disruptions that came later, but they carried something powerful, the first proof that the occupiers' iron grip could bend, even if only by an inch. And as the men who carried out those small acts returned to their homes before sunrise, boots muddy and nerves raw, they began to sense a change brewing beneath the fear, a change that would soon call for bolder strikes. It was a night when sound seemed to travel farther than it should. Even the crunch of frozen soil under a boot felt loud enough to give them away. Somewhere in central Poland, the exact place left unspoken among the men, a thin mist clung to the ground as if trying to hide them from whatever patrolled the tracks. They had gathered just before midnight, 5 men, no more. A tiny group for a task that felt larger than any of them wanted to admit. Their leader carried a small satchel pressed tight under his coat, its weight familiar by now. Homemade explosive, a short length of wire, a battery wrapped in cloth. It wasn't much, yet it was enough if placed with care. The leader moved first, sliding down the shallow embankment. The others followed in single file. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each had rehearsed the steps in his mind for days. Reach the chosen section of track. Stay low. Work quickly. Stay calm. A faint smell of oil hung in the air, evidence of the trains that passed almost hourly. The line carried heavy freight most nights, supplies meant for units fighting far to the east. That was why the Home Army had picked it. Slow down a shipment here, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a division waited longer for what it needed. The men reached the rail and knelt. Their breath rose in white puffs. The leader unwrapped the charge, checked the wires with hands that had done this enough times to trust muscle memory more than thought. 2 of the others kept watch, scanning the path for the distant glow of lanterns or the rhythmic steps of a German patrol. A few minutes passed, maybe more. Time in such moments tended to curl in on itself. When the device was finally secured, the men eased back into the brush. The leader tested the battery connection, then placed the trigger beneath his coat to keep it warm. Cold wires could stiffen, and he wasn't willing to risk that. The scheduled freight was expected after 3 in the morning. They had at least an hour, maybe less. They sat in the shadows, backs against trees, letting the silence hold them. One of the younger fighters wiped frost from his rifle, though he knew it would likely stay silent. Firearms were only for retreat, never for starting anything. Then, faintly, the first tremor reached them, like a heartbeat inside the steel. The leader felt it through the ground before he heard it, a steady, heavy rhythm, the unmistakable approach of a loaded train. He signaled the others to spread out. No words, just a sharp tilt of his head. Moments later, the sound grew, metal grinding, wheels biting the track, an engine pushing hard through the cold. The darkness ahead brightened with a dull glow as the locomotive rounded a bend. The leader steadied his breath. His thumb hovered over the switch. Not yet. He waited for the freight to pass the marker tree they had chosen earlier, a crooked old pine that leaned toward the track as if listening. The engine roared past. Dozens of wagons followed, sagging under their loads. When the 10th wagon crossed the hidden charge, the leader pressed the switch. A single flash, a punch of sound, muffled by the open fields. The rail buckled, the wagons lurched, metal shrieked in protest as the freight heaved sideways, spilling into the darkness in a storm of sparks and splintered wood. The night swallowed the chaos, leaving only shouts from the crew car and the hiss of escaping steam. The men did not wait to see the full wreck. They slipped back through the trees, each step quick but controlled. The leader was the last to turn away. For a moment he looked at the rising plume of steam and dust, not with pride, but with a heavy awareness of what this act would set in motion. Behind him, the broken train groaned in the cold air. Ahead of him, the forest offered the only cover they had. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this night would ripple farther than any of them could see. Remained an isolated echo on the rail. It became part of a pattern. Over time, the men of the underground discovered that each strike, even small, nudged the machinery of occupation off balance. From January 1941 through June 1944, AK and its predecessor resistance networks carried out more than 25,000 sabotage acts. In that period alone, they damaged about 6,130 locomotives, wrecked 19,058 rail wagons, derailed 732 transports, and destroyed 38 railway bridges. Each derailment, not even when it seemed small, forced hours of repair, disrupted timetables, delayed supplies, and made German commanders reroute trains or assign more guards. For Germany, that meant wasted fuel, lost time, diverted manpower, and creeping uncertainty over every journey across Poland's rails. As resistance grew, so did its ambition. Operations like Operation Wieniec, carried out on the night of 78 October 1942, targeted railway lines around a key hub, Warsaw. In that one coordinated act, multiple rail tracks were blown, freezing rail traffic for nearly half a day. That strike, planned by only a few dozen men, proved something powerful. When the underground worked together, the occupiers' supply arteries could be paralyzed for hours, even days. By 1943, sabotage by AK had become nearly routine. Far from the hesitant, clumsy attempts of the early years, the number of attacks quadrupled compared to 1942, and rail sabotage became a central weapon. On some nights, trains meant to carry supplies to the Eastern Front, weapons, fuel, food, sat stalled on broken tracks. Other nights, locomotives and wagons lay twisted in the frost, their cargo lost or ruined. Every such loss bit into the resources feeding the war far away, making each sabotage far more than just a local disruption. For those who planned these acts, the weight of responsibility grew, not just for the operation itself, but for what might come after. German reprisals were common. Villages could suffer. Innocents might pay the price. Yet resistance carried on, because each act chipped away at the occupier's certainty and strengthened the hope of a Poland that refused to be broken. In that way, the derailment in the dark wood, the one under the moonlight, was more than a moment. It was one stitch in a web of resistance, a gesture that helped bring strain, delay, and uncertainty to a war engine built on certainty and fear. And in the broken rails, one could sense a shift, not just in steel, but in fate. By the winter of 1943, the resistance had grown large enough that its numbers were whispered in kitchens and barns across the countryside. But inside those numbers were faces, tired, hopeful, frightened, stubborn, and none of them felt like the fighters history books often describe. Some were railway workers who knew every mile of track the way others know the lines of their own hands. They spent their days under German supervision, pretending not to notice troop movements or new rules. But at night they shared details with trusted neighbors, a shift in the timetable, a new guard with a careless habit, a weak point in the rail that no one had gotten around to mending. Others were students forced out of their classrooms when the occupiers shut down schools. They met in secret lessons, learning forbidden subjects, reciting banned poems, and carrying messages tucked into their sleeves. Many of them joined sabotage teams long before they were old enough to shave regularly. There were farmers, too, men and women who worked frozen soil from dawn to dusk. They hid fugitives in barns, kept watch on passing convoys, and lent resistance fighters their fields when the forest grew too dangerous. Their hands stayed rough even in winter, yet they handled hidden maps and small charges with astonishing care. And then there were the quiet ones, the ones no one suspected. The elderly shopkeeper who spent his afternoon sweeping outside his door, listening without appearing to. The midwife who walked from village to village, carrying messages and handwritten notes stitched inside her coat lining. The postman who risked his life every time he slipped a coded letter into the wrong bag on purpose. Their courage wasn't loud. It didn't look like something meant for statues. It was courage made of small decisions. To trust someone, to pass a name along, to hide a stranger for a single night. Fear lived beside them. Every knock on a door could be danger. Every stranger's gaze could mean betrayal. Yet most kept going because the alternative felt worse, to watch their country vanish in silence. A rail line stalled for a day. A patrol that never found the hidden store of weapons beneath a woodpile. A message from London broadcast through a crackling radio, its signal thin but its promise clear. These were the things that carried the movement forward, not bravado, but the steady pulse of everyday people who decided that even a small act, done in darkness, was better than surrendering the light. And from those countless small acts, the resistance drew its strength, one steady breath at a time. In the spring of 1944, the underground was no longer a few men hiding in basements. Armia Krajowa, AK, had grown into what many called the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe, with hundreds of thousands ready, though not all armed, under its command. The months of sabotage, derailments, broken rails, ruined freight, they were no longer isolated stabs in the dark. They had taught the occupier fear, uncertainty. They forced trains to stop, supply trains to reroute, troops to wait, shipments to rot. Those small acts had quietly changed the balance, weakened the occupier's certainty, and bought time and hope for something greater. As German forces retreated under pressure from the advancing Soviet fronts, the leadership within AK saw a chance. Plans once theoretical of taking back cities, of restoring a free Poland, of ending the occupation from inside, began to crystallize. The sabotage groups, once small and secretive, were now part of a larger plan, to rise across Poland when the moment felt right. In mid-1944, many resistance members believed that a broader uprising could succeed. Supplies from abroad, covert radio messages to London, and intelligence flowing out of occupied Poland reinforced that belief. Then came the orders. When German forces began withdrawing and the time was near, local AK units should act, liberate cities, secure Polish control before foreign armies arrived. What had been sabotage, what had been small raids against supply lines, would become the backbone of a national movement for freedom. So the rails that once carried occupation supplies became a memory, replaced by the soft march of resistance, by whispered plans in hidden rooms, by determined hearts ready to fight not just for disruption but for liberation. In that shift, from hidden partisan to organized force, the fate of Poland for a few bright months seemed uncertain, fragile, and yet hopeful. And somewhere in that hope lay the spark that would set the streets alight. The war ended. The foreign armies left. But for many of those who had fought quietly in basements beside railway tracks under moonlight, there was no welcome, no cheers, no medals. Instead came suspicion, silence, even betrayal. 45. The Home Army, AK, was officially disbanded. Some believed their struggle was done. Others hoped the suffering might finally yield freedom. But reality struck hard. The new powers that moved into Poland saw AK not as liberators, but as a threat. Many former fighters, those who once crouched by rails or held secret maps, found themselves hunted. Thousands were arrested. Some were sent to Soviet prisons or gulags. Others faced summary executions or mysterious disappearances. Even those spared imprisonment found their lives hollowed. The new regime, eager to erase what AK had stood for, banned mention of its name. Monuments, books, even private memories of resistance were suppressed. For decades, the actions of people who risked everything were painted as reactionary, dangerous, anti-state. Some tried to rebuild in silence. Others fled to avoid suspicion. Many changed names, quietly faded into towns or villages, trying to live simple lives, haunted by memories no one dared speak about. A few held secret meetings under the cover of dark basements, hoping to keep alive what the world tried to bury. For a long time, even their bravery was denial. Survival meant forgetting. Their stories of sabotage, resistance, railway tracks torn apart under moonlight were erased or twisted. The wartime ledger of courage was closed and replaced by silence. It was as if that derailment under the stars, the frozen fields, the hiss of escaping steam, all of it had never happened. Yet some memories persevered, in whispers between old men, in letters hidden under floorboards, in the grief of families who lost brothers or fathers, and deep in secret hearts, a quiet truth refused to die, that once ordinary people stood, risked, acted, not for glory, but for hope. In that silence after victory, you could almost feel the weight of what was lost, not just tracks and trains, but a kind of justice that never came. And for many the question stayed, long into the night, unspoken, what had it all been for? If the world turned its back, the moment the guns fell silent? Years later, if you walked that same stretch of track, you wouldn't know what happened there. The rails were replaced long ago. The embankment was reshaped. Grass covered the scars as if time itself wanted to smooth everything over. Only the wind seemed to remember, brushing through the pines with a tone that hinted at old secrets. But if you stood there long enough, in the early hours before sunrise, you might sense something beneath the quiet, the faint memory of metal twisting, a shout swallowed by the dark, the pulse of 5 men running for their lives through frozen brush. Moments that never made it into official papers, yet somehow shaped the path of a nation. The leader from that night never spoke much about what he'd done. Most didn't. They carried their memories like worn stones in their pockets, always present, rarely shown. He lived out his life the way many former fighters did, working, keeping to himself, watching the world change in ways he had once only whispered about in safe rooms and forests. Sometimes on cold mornings, he would wake before dawn. He'd feel that same stillness in the air, the kind that presses on a man's chest just before a train arrives. And for a moment he'd be back in the frost, thumb resting on a battery switch, listening for the tremor that would decide everything. He never called himself a hero. He never asked anyone to remember his name. What mattered to him was the simple fact that for one night, he and a handful of men pushed back against a force that believed it could not be touched. No speeches, no banners, just a strike of light in the winter dark. History often measures events by size, by armies, borders, treaties. But sometimes it turns on smaller things. A quiet decision made in the corner of a barn, a single wagon tipping into the cold, the steady hands of a man who refuses to bow. And on that silent stretch of rail, long after the world moved on, the echo of that refusal still lingers, soft, faint, but undeniably there.